The air was heavy, thick with the scent of burning frankincense and myrrh. Beneath it lingered something else, faint, almost hidden, like the shadow of fear itself. The last light of the sun crept through layers of silk curtains, staining the chamber with a dull amber glow. This was not the grandeur of Susa or Persepolis that poets sang about. This was the inner fortress of the King of Kings, the private heart of the empire, where no law but his own existed. Inside, a group of maids worked in silence. Their fingers moved quickly, trembling as they spread scented oils on the skin of a young woman. She could not have been more than 15. Her bones showed sharply beneath the thin veil draped across her shoulders. She stared ahead without seeing, her breath shallow, her mind caught between confusion and dread. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. She no longer remembered when she had arrived or how many nights had passed. She had stopped counting long ago. She did not know if she was the 100th or the 1,000th girl brought into these walls. Numbers no longer mattered here. Only one truth remained, and that truth froze her blood. The man waiting for her in the next room was not just the King of Kings. He was her father. Outside, the Persian Empire stretched from the mountains of India to the shores of Greece, a world built on conquest and wealth. But within these golden walls, another empire thrived, unseen by history. Here, power had twisted into something monstrous. Xerxes, son of Darius the Great, ruled over millions of souls and possessed riches beyond imagination. Yet absolute power is a poison that eats away at the soul. For a man who already owned the world, the only remaining conquest was his own limits. Behind the guarded doors of his palace, where no law of men could reach, power had turned into corruption. The walls glittered with gold, but beneath the surface, rot spread silently. This is not a story of heroic battles or glorious kings. It is the story of a cage disguised in silk, a prison of pleasure that hid a crime so deep even time tried to bury it. To understand the fall of Xerxes, we must first understand the machine that fed his delusion, the royal harem of Persia. It was no mere collection of women, but an empire within an empire, a place ruled by its own laws, invisible to the outside world. When Xerxes took his father's throne, he inherited more than land and armies. He inherited this institution of control, a world designed to please him, to obey him, and to hide his sins. The harem lay deep within the palace, its corridors endless and guarded by heavy cedar doors. Gardens trapped the sunlight, creating the illusion of paradise. Inside lived hundreds of women, a living mosaic of Persia's conquests. There were princesses sent from defeated kingdoms as pledges of peace. Daughters of Persian nobles offered as gifts to ensure loyalty. Dancers and musicians from every province. Each woman was part of a rigid hierarchy. None belonged to herself. They were all property of the empire and therefore of the king. The harem was governed by eunuchs, men who had been cut off from any family line of their own. Their loyalty was absolute because it was their only purpose. They were spies, guards, and executioners. Nothing entered or left the harem without their knowledge. Every woman who crossed its gates underwent a transformation. She was taught to move, to sing, to speak, and to obey. Her beauty became her weapon, her silence her only shield. A glance could elevate her to the rank of royal wife. A single mistake could end her life. It was a world of whispers and hidden daggers, where smiles were as dangerous as swords. A paradise gilded in gold, and yet a perfect prison. But inside this cage, something began to grow, something even the architects of this system had not foreseen. Children. When a concubine conceived within the harem and gave birth to a girl, that child was marked from her first cry. She was royal by blood but belonged to no world outside. The daughters of the harem were neither slaves nor princesses. They lived in a shadow between both. Unlike the daughters of official queens, they were not raised for marriage or diplomacy. They were raised within the same walls that had imprisoned their mothers. For them, the harem was not a prison. It was the only world they had ever known. They learned to walk on marble floors, to speak softly, to lower their gaze. From birth, they were trained to obey. They were told their bodies did not belong to them. Their destiny belonged to the empire, and the empire was the king. As these daughters grew, so did Xerxes' madness. After his crushing defeat against the Greeks, especially the humiliating loss at Salamis, something inside him broke. The man who had once commanded 1,000,000 soldiers turned his fury inward. He could no longer conquer the world outside, so he began to conquer the only realm he still controlled completely. Absolute power began to rot his mind. Pleasure was no longer enough. When every desire can be fulfilled instantly, desire itself loses meaning. Beauty becomes dull. Submission becomes ordinary. So power seeks transgression. It needs new frontiers to violate, new taboos to break, just to feel alive. And that was when the darkness began to take shape. Greek historians like Herodotus later whispered of a terrible obsession that consumed Xerxes. His lust for his brother's wife, and later, for her daughter, his own niece. Rejection only inflamed him. The line between family and possession blurred until nothing human remained. For Xerxes, everything and everyone was his to command, including the lives he himself had created. The daughters born within the harem reached womanhood in silence, unaware of the fate waiting for them. They were kept close, never married off, never allowed to leave. The eunuchs knew. The maids knew. Even their mothers knew, but silence was the only survival. To speak was to die. And so, within the heart of the greatest empire on earth, a nightmare continued to unfold, hidden behind silk curtains and guarded walls. The palace at night was a labyrinth of whispers. Behind every carved cedar door, shadows moved in silence, guided by fear more than duty. The eunuchs, wrapped in dark robes, patrolled like ghosts. Their steps were soft, their faces without expression. They were the keepers of a secret that no one dared to speak aloud. Inside the harem, the air was different, heavier. It carried the scent of rose oil, of incense burned to mask despair. Women's laughter echoed faintly down the corridors, carefully measured and rehearsed, the kind of laughter that existed only because it was required. In a far chamber, the daughters of the harem grew up like caged birds. They played among fountains and silk curtains, surrounded by beauty that hid their captivity. They were taught poetry, dance, and the language of submission. Every gesture, every word, every breath was part of their training. None of them knew the world beyond these walls. The horizon, the markets, the cities, all existed only in stories whispered by their mothers before sleep. They were royal blood yet nameless, precious yet powerless. To the world outside, they did not exist. Their mothers watched them grow with a quiet terror, knowing what waited ahead. Every daughter who reached womanhood became a threat and a target. They tried to hide them, to keep them unseen, but the harem was ruled by order and records. Every birth was noted, every girl catalogued. And the king always knew. The man once called the King of Kings, who had commanded legions and built palaces that touched the sky, had retreated into his inner world. The harem had become his empire. His victories were no longer fought with armies but with bodies. His power no longer needed witnesses. He sought control not over nations, but over souls. At first, it was whispered that Xerxes had grown distant, unpredictable, cruel. Servants spoke of sudden outbursts, of nights when the king demanded music, wine, and laughter, and mornings when silence fell like a shroud and someone was missing. The harem's eunuchs, those mutilated guardians of order, became the king's instruments. They prepared the women, selected them, delivered them without question or hesitation. Their eyes saw everything but understood nothing. They existed to serve, not to feel. And as the seasons passed, the unthinkable became routine. When one of the king's own daughters was chosen, there was no protest. There could be none. Who among them could defy the living god of Persia? The eunuchs led her through the silent corridors. The maids bathed her, perfumed her, and dressed her in the finest silk. Their hands shook, but they said nothing. They knew the ritual. They had done it countless times before. In another world, the act would have been called a crime. Here, it was called divine will. The young woman was brought before her father, the ruler of 1,000 cities, the son of Darius, the earthly image of Ahura Mazda. The man who had once chained the sea itself out of rage now stood in a chamber that smelled of myrrh and decay, a god trapped in his own sickness. She bowed, as she had been taught since childhood. He looked at her not as a father, but as something he had created and therefore owned. To him it was not lust, it was dominion, the ultimate proof that nothing, not even nature itself, could defy him. Power, when absolute, consumes itself. For Xerxes, pleasure had ceased to satisfy long ago. What he now sought was the feeling of breaking boundaries, of proving, even to himself, that he was beyond all law. And so, the unspoken rule that even tyrants feared to cross became his obsession. The harem became a theater of shadows, a place where horror wore the mask of ritual. The eunuchs knew, the women knew, but silence was the only law stronger than the king's will. Those who whispered vanished. Those who obeyed survived for a while. The historian Xerxes, who served as a physician in the Persian court, wrote fragments of what he had seen. Veiled hints of decay, words that survived only because they were wrapped in caution. His record spoke of a sickness in the palace, a darkness that spread from the heart of the king himself. For the daughters born in that darkness, there was no escape. They were raised to worship the very man who would one day destroy them. Their entire lives were shaped to serve one purpose, to please the king. They were taught to find beauty in obedience, to mistake fear for devotion. It was a system so perfect, so complete, that no one inside could even imagine rebellion. To the outside world, Persia was still magnificent. Its armies vast, its palaces radiant, its people proud. But within its golden heart, the rot deepened. The mothers of the harem, once rivals for the king's attention, now united in quiet dread. They tried to protect their daughters, hiding them, disguising them as servants, praying that the king's eyes would not notice. But nothing escaped the eunuch's lists. Nothing escaped the machinery of control. When the summons came, there was no refusal. A name spoken in the night was a sentence. And so, the harem lived in a silence deeper than death. A silence filled with the rustle of silk, the scent of burning oil, and the knowledge that the walls themselves were witnesses. The empire outside began to tremble. Xerxes no longer attended council meetings. The governors grew bold, corruption spread like a plague, and rebellion flickered in distant provinces. But none of it mattered to the king. He had conquered the world once. Now he ruled over something far greater, a kingdom of fear, bound not by swords, but by silence. The greatest empire on earth had become the grave of its ruler's soul. By the time the great king entered the later years of his reign, the grandeur of Persia had begun to hollow. The marble pillars still shone, the banners still flew, but the heart of the empire beat weakly beneath the weight of its ruler's madness. Xerxes had withdrawn almost completely from the world beyond his gates. The council of nobles met without him. The governors ruled their provinces with growing arrogance. He trusted no one, not his generals, not his family, not even the priests of Ahura Mazda. In the hidden chambers of his palace, the true empire of Xerxes endured, an empire of secrecy, pleasure, and terror. He began to wander the corridors of the harem late at night, barefoot, wrapped in a thin robe, his hair disheveled. The eunuchs followed a few steps behind, carrying lamps. Wherever he went, silence followed. The women would lower their eyes and press their foreheads to the floor. He would stop, look at one, sometimes smile, sometimes not. And when he left, she was never seen again. His paranoia deepened. He ordered the walls of the harem rebuilt, thicker, higher. He had mirrored ceilings installed in his chambers so he could see every corner. He believed spies hid inside the shadows. He believed the gods whispered through the walls. In truth, it was his own mind turning against him. The empire he had once ruled stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, but his world had shrunk to a maze of corridors and silken curtains. The great conqueror who had once stood on the shores of Greece, commanding fleets of 1,000 ships, now ruled over nothing but his fears. Yet within the harem, the machinery continued to function with mechanical precision. Every morning, eunuchs recorded the lists who had fallen ill, who had pleased the king, who had vanished. Every night, the same rituals repeated. Music, incense, and silence. The women spoke to each other in coded gestures, their words stripped of meaning. The older ones carried the scars of survival. The younger ones carried the dread of inevitability. And among them moved the daughters of Xerxes, children of his own blood, trapped in a system that erased their existence. They lived with the knowledge of what awaited them, pretending not to understand until the day understanding arrived too late. The tragedy was no longer hidden. It had become the normal rhythm of life. Even the palace servants, those who never entered the harem, whispered of the king's sickness. They said he no longer saw people, only possessions, that his eyes had become like those of a dead man. A story spread quietly through the court, that one night Xerxes had stood before a mirror for hours, speaking to his reflection, asking if it was still loyal to him. When it didn't answer, he shattered the glass with his bare hands and ordered the eunuchs to punish the traitor hiding inside. No one laughed. The madness of the ruler was no longer a rumor. It had become a state secret. Greek accounts that survived, Herodotus, Ctesias, and others, described this decay with cautious disgust. They spoke of a king consumed by guilt, crushed by the humiliation of his defeat in Greece, and suffocated by the power he had built. Some said the gods themselves had abandoned him. Others said he had simply become one. Inside the harem, the walls began to close in. The eunuchs, once silent functionaries, now ruled like ministers. They decided which women were seen and which were forgotten. They traded secrets like gold. Their power grew as the king's sanity faded. For the women, life became an endless performance. They smiled when they were terrified. They danced while their hearts broke. The daughters learned early how to hide emotion, how to look calm when their mothers wept, how to pray without words. And yet, in that silence, there were still moments rare, fragile when the human soul tried to breathe. One of the daughters, said to be the youngest born in the harem, would sneak into the garden at night when the guards changed their shifts. She would sit by the pool and whisper to her reflection, asking questions no one could answer. Why was she born here? Why did the stars look so far away? She had no name that history remembers. None of them did. Their father's empire was built to last forever. Yet inside his own walls, everything was already dying. Even the eunuchs began to fear what they served. Some prayed for his death in secret. Others plotted how to survive him. The harem, once a symbol of divine pleasure, had turned into a tomb that breathed. Outside, rebellion stirred. The provinces were restless, and the satraps grew greedy. The treasury drained itself into luxury and war. But inside the palace, the only battles were fought in silence between guilt and fear, obedience and despair. Xerxes' nights grew longer. He would summon musicians, then fall asleep before they played. He would demand dancers, then sit unmoving, staring through them. He was haunted not by the enemies who had defeated him, but by the ghosts he had created within his own house. Every step he took was followed by the echo of a whisper he could no longer ignore, a whisper that sounded like the voice of his daughters. It was said that in his final months he forbade mirrors altogether. He ordered every reflective surface removed from his chambers. He couldn't bear to see the man he had become. But the truth of his downfall did not come from gods or enemies. It came from those closest to him, men who had stood at his side for years, watching the empire rot, waiting for the moment to strike. The captain of the royal guard, Artabanus, saw what no one else dared to see. He saw a ruler who was no longer a king, a god who had become a monster. And he understood that the only way to save Persia was to end the man who ruled it. The end came quietly, without the thunder of armies or the clash of swords. It began with a whisper in the corridors, a plan born from despair and exhaustion. Artabanus, captain of the royal guard, had watched his king's decline for years. He had seen the corruption spread like rot through the palace, had seen servants vanish, had seen the light fade from Xerxes' eyes. He had guarded the door to the king's chambers and heard what no man should ever hear, the muffled sobs, the broken prayers, the silence that followed. He knew the empire could not survive another season under a mad god. And so he began to plot. The night chosen for the act was like any other in the fortress, warm, thick with the scent of burning oil. The corridors were silent, the harem asleep. Artabanus walked alone toward the royal quarters, his steps slow, his face calm. He had convinced the king's chief eunuch, Aspameters, to aid him, a man who knew the darkest workings of the harem and had grown sick of them. Xerxes lay asleep, surrounded by the trophies of his own depravity. Silk curtains, gold vessels, the perfume of myrrh that clung to everything he touched. His breath was uneven, his body thinner than anyone remembered. The once mighty ruler of the world looked like an old man drowning in his own luxury. Artabanus stood over him for a long moment. Perhaps he hesitated. Perhaps he pitied him. Then he drew his dagger. Death came swiftly. There were no words, no resistance, only the sound of a blade cutting through silk and flesh. The god-king of Persia died as a man, alone and unguarded. The silence that followed felt like the first breath of freedom the palace had taken in years. But it was not peace, it was the beginning of chaos. When dawn came, the harem was already in uproar. Eunuchs shouted orders, guards ran through the corridors, and rumors spread like fire. Some said the gods had struck the king down. Others said demons had entered the palace. Artabanus moved quickly, declaring himself protector of the realm. But his plan depended on confusion. He blamed Xerxes' eldest son, Darius, for the murder, and in the chaos that followed, he manipulated Xerxes' younger son, Artaxerxes, into executing his own brother. The empire that had once trembled beneath the command of one man now tore itself apart under the ambition of many. In the harem, the women waited. They had heard the screams, the clash of metal, the running feet. Some hoped for freedom. Others only prayed for safety. But when the new king took the throne, nothing changed. The women of the harem, hundreds of them, were not freed. They were simply reassigned. They passed from the ownership of the dead king to that of the living one. The machinery of control, the silence, the fear, it all continued, unchanged. The daughters of Xerxes, those nameless victims of the empire's hidden cruelty, were left behind like shadows. Their lives had been erased before they had even begun. When the palace servants whispered of the dead king, they lowered their voices when they spoke of his daughters of the harem. No one ever recorded their names. No one dared. History remembered Xerxes as a conqueror, as the builder of palaces and roads, as the man who fought the Greeks. It did not remember the world he built inside his walls, the one made of silk and silence, of gold and despair. The Greek chroniclers, writing from afar, recorded fragments of truth. They told of a ruler who had gone mad with power, who believed himself divine, who could no longer tell the difference between love and ownership. But even they could not capture the full horror that had unfolded behind the walls of his palace. And so the harem remained a legend, a place of mystery, whispered about but never truly known. In time, Persepolis would fall. The palaces Xerxes built would burn. The marble would crack, the gold would fade. The great empire he inherited and corrupted would crumble into dust. But the curse he left behind, the curse of absolute power, would outlive him. The true tragedy of Xerxes was not only his madness, but the system that made it possible. A system that stripped humanity from one group and gave godhood to another. A system built to protect power at any cost, to hide the crimes committed in its name. The harem was never just a place. It was an idea, a living symbol of control, submission, and secrecy. And when its master died, the silence it had bred did not die with him. It seeped into the stones of the palace, into the stories of future kings, into the way history itself was written. Because history, as it's told, belongs to the victors. The names of kings are carved in stone. The names of their victims are lost in the sand. Somewhere in that forgotten silence, in a buried chamber of the ruined palace, the ghosts of Xerxes' daughters still linger. Their laughter once filled those walls. Their cries were never heard beyond them. They remain the unseen witnesses to the fall of a god. And if there is any justice left in history, it is this, that every time we speak their story aloud, the silence of the harem breaks a little more.